nonpartisan think tank dedicated to promoting ideas that support diplomacy, constructive engagement, and prudent realism in international affairs. To assist in the discussion and to recall the outcomes emerging from the 2023 summit, I have four distinguished panelists. Andrew Rasiulis is a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, a freelance consultant with Andrew Rasiulis Associates Inc., and a former Department of National Defense official. From 1986 to 1989, Andrew was the D&D representative of NATO's high-level task force for conventional arms control. Next, we have Anessa Kimball, who is a full professor at the Université Laval, a coordinator for the Canadian Defense and Security Network, and a member of the Defense and Security Foresight Group North American team. Zachary Paikin is a non-resident fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and a researcher at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels. Zachary is also a member of the D&D-funded Network for Strategic Analysis. He also serves as chair of the Younger Generation Leaders Network on Euro-Atlantic Security. Lastly, we have Paul Robinson. Paul is a senior fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy and a professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. He is the author of numerous books and articles on Russian and Soviet history and contemporary international affairs. Welcome, everyone. Before we get into the questions, I'd just like to inform the audience that we will be monitoring the chat board throughout the webinar. So if anyone has any questions or any inquiries, please direct them to the chat board and we will get to them during our audience questions. So now, without further ado, let's get right into it. We can state that the results of the summit are good, but if there had been an invitation to join NATO, they would have been perfect. President Zelensky's remarks following the Vilnius Summit provide the context to the expectations that many had anticipated. Although Ukraine did not get full membership, much was accomplished at the summit, ranging from a lengthy 90-point joint communique, reaffirming Ukraine's future in NATO, the creation of the NATO-Ukraine Council, and Turkey agreeing in principle to back Sweden's admission to the alliance, along with a pledge for modernizing the alliance's forces and capabilities. The summit also noted momentous events, whether it be Finland participating as a full member for the first time after joining on April 4th, 2023, the second consecutive appearance of Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand holding discussions with the North Atlantic Council as non-members, the launch of the NATO-Japan Partnership Program, to the G7 who participated at the summit, and vowing to send swift and sustained security assistance, modern military equipment across land, sea, and air domains, and economic assistance to Ukraine. By the end of the summit, it was clear that the discussions, promises, and plans announced and shared began an implementation for a NATO of tomorrow, setting the stage for the 2024 NATO Summit that will mark the 75th anniversary of the alliance. For Canada, the 2023 NATO Summit offered Ottawa an opportunity to recapitalize on its commitments and obligations for transatlantic security, given that Canadian soldiers in Latvia are reportedly personally purchasing military gear and equipment, a leaked document exposing Prime Minister Trudeau's sentiment of Canada never getting to the targeted 2% of GDP spending on defense, to Ottawa not sending fighter jets to participate in Air Defender 23, the largest Air Force deployment exercise in NATO's history. With so much information arising from the summit, it's time to take a step back and assess the outcomes. So the first question that I will pose, and this is for every panelist, we'll just get directly to the summit and the outcomes of it. And that is, was the 2023 NATO Summit a success for the alliance? And in your opinion, did a particular country or was there an inter-alliance bloc who achieved more than others during the summit? And if so, we'll start with you. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, I think this was a summit that, while there were pretty high expectations about things that were going to move on some files, particularly Ukraine, there were also some missteps along the way. I think the final communique reads a lot like most communiques that come out of these summits. It's a bit of a mixed bag. There was quite a bit of focus on Russia, which we expected for sure. The language around Ukraine was not very much of a change from the language that we have seen before. And, some people were pointing to the fact that, NATO saying that it wasn't going to that I had decided not to pursue a membership action plan with Ukraine was a sign that things are going to move faster. As someone who's actually studied the enlargement process, quantitatively, I can say that I definitely don't agree with that. I think that it was more about NATO trying to not tie its hands there. NATO simply didn't want to commit itself to a timeline. It didn't want to commit itself to a membership action plan, particularly given Ukraine's individual history with membership action plans, which of course nobody knows very much about. And I've actually read them. and looked at their evaluations. And I can tell you that, the outcome evaluations of previous plans have not exactly been rosy. And so, I think there's a lot of pundits saying things without really knowing what's going on the inside. And I think this is also a bit the case in general about Ukraine. But I mean, at the other end of the day, we did see, Zelensky bringing that drama, that theatricalness that we know that he has, to the summit. And I think that also, served to again, bring that attention. But at the end of the day, I would say, will this be a particularly memorable summit? Certainly, I think Finland taking part 100%, this is something that is memorable and quite important. But on the sides of the rest of it, I would say this is, pretty standard.
Thank you. Zach, we'll direct it now to you and kind of give your opinions and thoughts. Particularly when we see summits that pass, particularly, the 2022 summit that came on the heels of the Russian invasion. Was there anything substantial that came out of this summit for the alliance? And was there any kind of proclamations or any announcements that caught your eye thinking, this is substantive for the alliance going forward, to obviously build better cohesion and unity within the alliance, obviously with the Ukraine membership question, but also just with regard to its capabilities to ensure that it has the capabilities and deterrence mechanisms to counter any kind of threats coming from Russia or China, or the growing assertiveness of China.
So, I mean, to answer your question overall, I'd say in some respects, yes, there are signs of success and progress, and in other respects, perhaps less so. And I think the way to think about this is sort of to conceptualize NATO as being torn between two fundamental pillars of its existence, or of its mission. You've got sort of this primary pillar, and by the way, you saw this really much on display, earlier this month. You've got the primary pillar that centers on NATO being an interest-based alliance that is focused on the territorial defense on its members, right? That's the core mission. Then you've got this second pillar that has particularly manifested itself in the post-Cold War era of not being as much of an interest-centric, but more of a norm-centric organization that is focused on putting forward a certain vision of Euro-Atlantic security, rooted in norms, for example, such as the freedom of states to choose, the open door policy, things like that. There was a third pillar as well, which is sort of, rather than interests and norms, the sort of values basket, as it were, sort of the community of values conceptualization of NATO as well. That seems to have fallen a little bit by the wayside, given developments that occur within countries like Poland, Hungary, Turkey, even the United States, both in terms of not just what goes on within the US, but its international behavior as well. But the tension between those first two pillars, between interests and territorial defense on the one hand, and norms and open door policy on the other hand, I think was very much present. So in terms of that first pillar, you've got a strategy for territorial defense now that runs 4,000 pages or so. That's quite significant. That shows that NATO is rediscovering ultimately what its raison d'etre is. And it goes across several different vectors. So that's an interesting sign that different actors within the alliance have been able to reconcile effectively their plans for territorial defense in terms of priorities. I think that's something that has been less than evident in terms of political struggles within Euro-Atlantic institutions in the Western political community in general, in which, for example, certain member states have been concerned that the eastward vector is being prioritized over the southward vector, et cetera. Now again, we're not privy to all the information, but at least this is a significant step forward from what we can tell. The consolidation of the Baltic Sea region, with Sweden's forthcoming accession, is a further step in that direction as well. You need to think of that in terms of territorial defense. So in that entire first basket, there's elements of progress that you can point to. On the second basket, I think there's still no answer. I think that's the problem ultimately, right? On this question of Ukraine's right to choose, this is something that we've been reiterating for a long, long time, and that we're no closer to answering anytime soon. I mean, the formulation that we saw, besides the inclusion of the word that Ukraine will be invited, perhaps the term invited is substantial, but that aside, of course, Ukraine is going to be invited only when allies agree and when conditions are met. That means nothing. That's a reiteration of boilerplate phrasing, right? So, and I think the thing that we really need to highlight here is that, what we got out of this summit, we got out of a U.S. administration and a U.S. president that is likely to be the most pro-Atlanticist, pro-Europe administration that we may see in the United States for decades, possibly, right? Because the next generation of folks who are going to be sitting in the White House will not have grown up through the Cold War, through the 1990s, and have not lived through that particular Eurocentric worldview and Eurocentric set of priorities, policy priorities and norms. But also, as China continues to occupy more and more and more of the focus of Washington, D.C., Ukraine and Europe are going to look a lot more like regional problems rather than global problems, right? China is the only power that can actually claim to be, approaching global power status, that can challenge U.S. interests increasingly globally. And even the Ukraine war is being viewed in Washington in some respects through the China lens, right? In terms of what role is China going to play in the European security order in terms of bringing about a ceasefire, reconstruction in Ukraine? How much is this war making Russia increasingly dependent on China? The China lens is very much there, right? So the more time goes by and the more the U.S. is interested in China and less in, it's not a zero-sum game, obviously, European security, but nonetheless, I think it's going to lead by definition to more of a transactional relationship rather than a norm-centric relationship between the United States and Europe, in which case, transactionalism, is not going to be a mark just of the Trump administration. It's going to be a mark of subsequent U.S. administrations as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Zach. Andrew, we'll go to you and we'll kind of go off the point that Zachary kind of indicated, having this, the next generation of leaders, politicians, and intellectuals being of that post-Cold War kind of period. You yourself being the most senior, panelist on this webinar, when you've had your fair share of, of observing and partaking in NATO discussions and NATO summits, where does the 2023 summit scale up in your experience and in your opinion after having such an extensive lens with Canada and then also with NATO as well in your career?
Well, for me, I characterize this summit in Vilnius as a reality check summit because there was a lot of momentum going in this from certain sectors, particularly the eastern parts of the alliance, the Baltic states, Poland, the UK, interestingly enough, who were actually pushing for wasn't immediate accession of Ukraine into NATO, but it was going to be really soon, even before the war ended, maybe. No one was actually specific on that, but there were implications of that. And clearly there were huge debates within NATO leading up to the summit, because we had, for the first time in public, repeated explanations by officials of NATO and member states when they clarified, on the day of the summit coming up, Ukraine will not get into NATO until the war is over. That was, for the first time, you really get that clarity, okay? And then you had, therefore, the consolation prizes that came into being. And the consolation prizes that's the reality check. Ukraine is not going to go into NATO. NATO will not go to war over Ukraine against Russia. We're not going to have World War III. So now that I think that was a watershed in this summit. And that, for me, was very important. And now it means that we settle down to the grind. And NATO has committed itself to a number of important things. I call it consolation prizes because it wasn't accession, but they're important stuff. There's a lot of material, a lot of money, and that kind of support going to Ukraine, but not people powers thing. And what the Ukrainians are at their weakest spot in all this is the people power. And they are running short. They're going to run short. NATO's not supplying them with people. And as the war of attrition continues, this is where I think the balance is going to start shifting and where this war is going. And NATO's package of assistance to Ukraine is about as good as it's going to get. And we're going to see where this takes us now. And NATO, the whole thing of the accession, that comes in with the end game negotiations that are down the road, which will be very interesting. And the Washington Summit 2024 is going to be really interesting.
Thank you, Andrew. Paul, we'll give you the last word for this question. Just picking your brain, obviously we've heard a lot saying, it's a mixed bag. If you look at it from a strategic standpoint, it may not have been as successful as previous years, but if you look at it for, like Andrew said, from a reality checkpoint, NATO and its members have really comprehended, okay, this is the reality of things on your periphery with the war going on in Ukraine and the forces that's at play. One of the criticisms I've seen from the communique in particular is emerging from Southern Europe, and that's and the concern that was kind of brought up is that it's very Eastern Europe, Northern Europe heavy. and it doesn't really focus too much on the pan-regional kind of Euro-Atlantic scale. And given that 2023 has been a kind of tumultuous year, especially if you look at North America with the balloon incidents that occurred early in February. And then if you look what's going on with the kind of dilemma over munitions, cluster munitions that Biden transferred to Ukraine, and kind of that kind of upheaval with among allies, what are your thoughts with the 23 summit? Did it address your concerns? Are the things still under discussed, or did it just continue on this kind of linear kind of discussion of here's what NATO is going to do, and these are the steps that it's going to take to achieve those ends?
Well, I mean, if you're talking in terms of success, I think you need to ask successful for who and how you define it. So, I mean, as an institution, if you talk about the interests of the institution of NATO, then I think they'll probably be fairly satisfied, particularly because of the promise of Swedish membership, although it may not be quite as secure as people think it is. But NATO as an institution will come away feeling it's a little stronger. But institutions don't exist for their own purpose. They exist in order to serve some other purpose. So, what is good for NATO as an institution? I mean, we shouldn't always think that's necessarily what is good for its members. And I've become increasingly cynical about this over the years. In my youth, I was a loyal NATO army officer in what was then West Germany. But as time goes on, I've become a little bit more cynical about this. And I don't, at the end of reading this communique, there was absolutely nothing in there which made me think, well, I feel safer as a result of this. And I don't think most people would, right? So when you say, well, what has it really contributed other than to making the alliance feel a bit better about itself? Obviously, not anything very obvious, to be quite frank. And I would slightly disagree with Andrew about realism. There was an interesting line in the communique which says that we will never accept, the annexed territory, Russian annexation of territories in Ukraine, including Crimea. Now that sounds, all very principled, but the problem of saying never is eventually you run up against a wall of reality. And what happens if Ukraine cannot take its territories back by force? Where does your never stand you at that point? And to me, the main problem which Europe faces, from a security point of view, is a danger of continued escalation of the war in Ukraine. And it wasn't obvious from me reading the NATO communique that they have any ideas about, how to bring that war to an end, other than continued escalation in the hope that somehow Russia collapses. Okay, and therefore I'm not convinced that realism has really struck. I'm also not convinced that if you're speaking about, as you did, about the Southern Europe, Mediterranean, that area, but there's huge amount of realism in that sector. There was a little section in the communique about North Africa and the Middle East, in which they threw in a few lines saying, Russia's stirring up trouble. But Russia's influence in the Middle East and especially in Africa is not very big compared with that of European countries in the United States. So if there are problems there, perhaps a little bit of introspection might be required. One might look back at the 2011 bombing of Libya and the consequences that had. And the answer, if you read the communique, always seems to be more NATO. But there's very little thinking about other ways of doing things and whether more NATO is really the answer. Okay, and I don't see any sort of original and out of the box thinking about sort. Instead, it's just like, let's spend more on defense and let's still have our 2% on defense, which is an entirely arbitrary figure dreamt up 9 years ago when conditions were entirely different. So in that sense, going back to, I think it was maybe Zach talking about capabilities, I can't remember, but we must look at our capabilities, but there's no capabilities in proper defense planning derived from strategy, which derives from perceptions of threats and so on. And you don't just plug up capabilities, right? You need to have a proper bottom-up view of like why you need these capabilities, what for, and we're not seeing that. We're just saying, well, we need to boost our capabilities, but therefore it's not very obvious. But there's a lot of deep strategic thinking going on under all this.
Thank you, Paul. we'll now transition to the part of the summit that I think really galvanized and really gripped the whole Euro-Atlantic community and probably elsewhere in the world too, and that is Ukraine's membership and the question of whether it's going to be fully admitted or if there's going to be conditions and what those conditions will be. And Anessa really hammered it kind of home when she said, President Zelensky attended the meeting and used his theatrics, which he's very well known for. And so I kind of want to discuss that. And in particular, following the first day of the summit, President Zelensky, tweeted that NATO and the United States' position to not grant Ukraine full membership was absurd and unprecedented. However, after the summit, President Zelensky asserted that Ukraine had achieved a significant security victory. So this kind of yin and yang kind of approach is interesting for me, kind of this coming from the landscape of, well, if you didn't get what you would tendly wanted, how come you see certain things as a victory when you were very adamant at the beginning that these were the end goals that you wanted? So we'll start with Andrew. When we see the language for Ukraine's membership, and this was discussed earlier, saying that there is an extension of an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree on conditions are met. So, Andrew, although the conditions are not laid out, what should we expect from NATO before it's admitted? What should we expect from Ukraine before it's admitted into NATO? Is it more a Ukraine-centric dilemma, or is it more of a NATO-centric dilemma?
It's a war-centric dilemma. The war has to be finished because NATO, and this is the reality I was talking about. I mean, I don't disagree with Paul's comments. The idea, the reality check for everybody was the fact that NATO was not going to accept Ukraine into NATO and that NATO was not going to go to war with Russia. That was the reality check. And I think Zelensky's comments on that first day when he said, well, this is absurd, I think that's his true feeling. The second day is a packaged response, to the consolation prize he was given. Now, and Biden's administration was furious at Zelensky's comment on that first day. So, behind the scenes, all that politics that goes on, and what I saw Zelensky being himself on day one by saying this is absurd. I believe he actually said that, and he meant that. And on the second day, it's glossing. It's playing politics. I have to say this because I have to go back to Kyiv and declare victory. So I'm going to do it, even though I didn't get victory. I didn't get all what I wanted, but you have to make the best of it because he's not going to go home and just say I failed. So you can't do that. So I think, and another interesting thing. I mean, it's a sidebar thing, but the British Defense Minister Ben Wallace's comment, which he said, to a reporter informally, but as a sign of frustration, interesting from the UK, about that the UK is not an Amazon supplier for Ukraine. I think there's a point of limitations here that NATO is saying, look, this is what we're going to do, and we're not going to do more, and you're going to have to fight it out without us, like essentially boots on the ground. No boots on the ground. And so again, I come back to the whole thing about people power shortages in Ukraine. Ukrainians know about that. And they're very worried, I think, where this is going. And then that leads to that uncertainty of how this war ends. And again, I'm one of those who think it'll be some kind of a ceasefire arrangement once a certain level of exhaustion sets in.
Well, Zach, we'll go to you. And I want to build off Andrew's point. In Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs magazine, there were issue after issue, article after article, I should say, saying NATO full membership for Ukraine can work if you follow a West-East Germany kind of setting. And then others would counter that argument saying if the territorial integrity of Ukraine isn't fixed and isn't constituted under international law and recognized by both Ukraine, NATO, and Russia, then full membership is not going to reinforce Article 5 of the treaty, because now it's, well, do we support and reinforce and defend Ukrainian territory that was held by Ukraine before the war or after some kind of ceasefire? So I just want to get your kind of perspective on things. Do you have a similar take like with Andrew, or do you have something maybe that would go forward in a different approach?
Well, first of all, just to clarify, Ukraine is not asking to be admitted to NATO as long as the war is going on. I think that's clear. I think what they're looking for is some sort of clear timeline for accession as soon as the war is over. Of course, the problem is, if you say that you can join as soon as the war is over, that gives Putin an incentive to keep waging the war for as long as possible. And I think he's very much capable of doing that, assuming he stays in power for quite some time to come. And that very well could be the case. I agree. I mean, I think you were citing Mary Surratt's article in Foreign Affairs. I agree with much of her analysis, which is that, the minute you say, that, according to the current line, we're going to apply Article 5, then you're effectively partitioning Ukraine and giving up on its territorial integrity, which is not something that we're prepared to do as of yet. And the minute you say, okay, well, let's start with what Ukraine has now and maybe add more Article 5 territory if it conquers more territory, then you're undermining Article 5 possibly, because, where exactly does the line of control lie at any moment? And, it's a political decision whether or not to activate Article 5 and in what respect, Article 5 is activated, what the actual response of allies is going to be, if it's perhaps something short, of fully fledged war with Russia. So, that has knock-on effects for the rest of the alliance in terms of how strong the pledge of deterrence is going to be. So I think at the end of the day, no one's really prepared to admit this, but either you've got to provide Ukraine with a clear timeline for entry into the alliance, or you have to close the door. And what NATO did at the summit was Bucharest plus or Bucharest minus, or call it whatever you want, but it's basically an attempt to continue sitting on the fence and not to have to answer that question in the name of preserving Allied unity. And this goes back to the Bucharest summit, which was a compromise, which ultimately was about preserving the unity of the alliance, but it was unity at the expense of substance. Because ultimately you ended up sending a signal to Russia, that you basically intend to evict it, for example, from its naval base in Sevastopol, that you intend to arm and train militaries that are on its border. But hey, by the way, by not launching a membership action plan, we're not going to respond, militarily if you choose to, impose a veto militarily right now and invade Ukraine or Georgia right now, right? So, I mean, it's the worst of all worlds in terms of signals that you could possibly send. So, my own personal view is that the open door policy may have served a certain purpose at a certain time. But, as I was sort of alluding to in my opening remarks, that second pillar, that normative pillar of NATO is facing an existential challenge right now. And we have to acknowledge that, whether we like it or not, under this president or another president, whether it's an intra-regime successor or an extra-regime successor, Russia is going to be an important, big country in Europe. It may not be a global great power, but it's a country of 145 odd million people. And it's basically impossible to envisage creating a stable European security order that fundamentally, does not take into account its declared interests. And so, we will have to come up with some sort of mechanism for, providing for the security of Ukraine and for enhancing Euro-Atlantic security more broadly. That is not a unilateral decision. NATO cannot set the terms of Euro-Atlantic security alone. I think that's something that we need to wrestle with, and I don't think that we're really prepared to wrestle with that just yet, unfortunately.
Thank you, Zach. Paul, we'll head to you, and I just want to maybe build upon what Zach was saying about NATO not just being the only entity defining Euro-Atlantic security. At the summit, the G7 came together and they made a very big announcement, a big pledge for long-term support for Ukraine. And so I was just wondering, with the G7 coming forth and announcing it at the summits and kind of having, inter-alliance kind of, I don't want to say disunity, but maybe a debate around whether or not Ukraine should be admitted. Just prior to the summit, France was kind of on the board, and then right before the summit, the French President Emmanuel Macron essentially said, Ukraine does belong in NATO, and that they are looking forward to those discussions. So, is there a dilemma within NATO in terms of conditions for Ukraine membership, and what role or what optics does having the G7 come forward and pledge long-term support for Ukraine? Does it harm NATO's collective unity on the topic of Kyiv's future in the alliance?
I don't think what you described is harmful. I think they're both basically working in the same direction, because the G7 is largely NATO members. So I don't think there's a massive sort of gap between what they're saying and doing. To me, if you talk about Ukrainian membership, NATO doesn't exist to serve Ukraine. It exists to serve its own members. Okay, so we have to consider what is in our interests? What would we get out of giving NATO membership to Ukraine? If we think we get something out of it, when we support it. If we don't think we get something out of it, we don't. But my problem is I don't see what we get out of it apart from, possibility of being embroiled in conflict or nuclear power. And particularly if the issue of borders is unresolved. If Andrew's right, and this war ends in a ceasefire, in which whatever boundaries the ceasefire is on are not mutually accepted by means of a peace treaty, then there's always the possibility of the war re-erupting. And if at that point NATO NATO offers membership to Ukraine, well, at that point Ukraine has, serious incentives to restart the war. I mean, everyone always looks at this on the Russian side, but there's also whether the Ukrainians want to keep fighting, and so if we bring Ukraine into NATO with unresolved borders, then we create a real possibility of this war restarting and then dragging us into it. So to my mind, it's not a matter of the war being over before Ukraine is offered membership. There has to be a peace treaty between Ukraine and Russia in order for a membership to be extended. Because without a peace treaty, we're in danger of being sucked into a future conflict. And that's not in our interest.
Thank you, Paul. Anessa, we'll give the last word to you. Feel free to bounce off or to counter or to support any of the arguments made forward. But in particular with you, I would like to get at the removal of the membership action plan. You had a great conversation with CGAI's Defense Deconstructed podcast about this topic. And so I was just wondering if you can, discuss and maybe just let the audience know what the membership action plan is, and just reveal about, what about NATO's decision to remove that? Does that imply for Ukraine's membership into the alliance?
Okay. So membership action plans can be quite varied, but one thing that's interesting about them is, number one, this is a process through which there's kind of a back and forth between NATO, actually it's the Partnership for Peace, and with the country. And it takes about a year to put together a membership action plan. And if you look at these membership action plans, they can have things that are quite general to things that are very, very specific. And by extremely specific, they will say things like, your national law XYZ is not consistent with this international law. You must change this, right? Ukraine has not done very well at doing those things in the past. And so one of the reasons why I think that they did not give Ukraine a plan is, frankly, it's at war. And if we ask it to do a lot of these things that it would have to do, that NATO would want it to do, recommend it to do in this action plan, it probably wouldn't be able to accomplish those things. And so again, right, there is a bit of, do we want to tie everyone's hands? The second part is these membership action plans actually have a duration of 2 years. So now we've added 3 years to the clock, because there's no NATO member that has ever been given accession to NATO after, while they were in an active membership action plan, right? And so I'm not talking about Finland and Sweden. I'm talking about all of the other countries that have joined NATO after the end of the Cold War. And I know this because, like I said, I did a quantitative study of this, and I can say that there's at least 2 other things that are highly important. When it comes to NATO, they care about political risk. And when I look at the political risk, the data that's produced by PRS, which political risk group, they produce data, it's available online. You look at Ukraine and you look at all of those other countries that have joined NATO, Ukraine is simply out of whack relative to those countries. So if you're going to ask Ukraine to join, I'm going to guess you're going to have a dozen other countries that are going to look to the left and right, say, hey, how come we had a bar that's up here and they get a bar that's down there, right? And this is really important because remember, this goes to national legislatures. And we know this because of what's going on now. And so while you might get national leaders to say, okay, fine, I think when we go to national parliaments in some of these other countries, these, this is all political parties and stuff like that. They may have very different opinions about whether or not Ukraine has met those criteria. The second thing, of course, that's important is that in the research that I showed, that I led, one of the things that was important is essentially whether it was a country level decision as whether or not each individual partner that could join would actually secure a NATO member more or less, right? It is clear that Ukraine would be a country that would make many states feel less secure that are actually NATO members, right? And again, this goes to the whole logic of everybody has to agree when they want to join the club. And so it's all great that Ukraine wants to join, it's ready to join and all of that. But frankly, when you look at the criteria that have been applied now to at least, 12 to 14 other states, it's not there. And it's quite far away from being there. And I think it's an uphill battle to say, well, they're in conflict, so maybe we should give them a little bit of margin of maneuver. But frankly, according to the NATO treaty, you cannot have an open conflict. You cannot have any border disputes. You have to have internationally recognized borders, right? And we know, again, all of these things are quite uphill, And so I think at the end of the day, it's great to talk about Ukraine getting into NATO. And of course, there's also a bit of confusion because people say, oh, well, maybe they'll get into the EU first. Again, historically, no other country that has joined after the Cold War entered the EU before it entered NATO. This is important because NATO secures that defense piece, right? And so frankly, when people are saying, oh, maybe they'll jump to the EU again, I would say those are all many of the same countries. And so you're going to have a bit of the same problem. And on their economic risk side, frankly, it is looking even worse in terms of their economic risk profile because of the active conflict. And there has been flight of businesses and all of that. And so a lot of the things that the EU looks at in terms of saying this is a good country to join, what was started out as an economic union, for example, again, questionable that Ukraine would actually be able to meet those criteria. Yeah, and so I think a lot of people are thinking about NATO and EU membership as kind of a panacea or a band-aid that you might give to kind of secure over the situation. But at the end of the day, we know that it's the partners that are in those institutions that make the decision. For example, Turkey has now been trying to get into the EU for many, many years, and they have recently tried to leverage that with Sweden's entry into NATO, which is a little bit funny. And I think we can, that's also worthy of discussion. But again, I think frankly, it's just people not understanding what those processes are and how they work on the inside.
Thank you. And this is I definitely agree with your point with the measure going back to the national legislator. And with kind of the different polarization, which obviously is in politics today, especially with the West, I think that will be, a key indicator of future membership, especially if you look at the United States, and especially if Donald Trump is reelected, or if a Republican similar to kind of his ideologies come in. It will be interesting to see if anything will proceed further. I now want to switch to Canada, and Canada's participation and kind of the announcements that occurred at the summit. As I indicated at the beginning of the webinar, Canada has had some poor optics when it comes to transatlantic security just this past year. But at the summit, the Prime Minister announced a $551 million in new funding and projects to support Ukraine, ranging from providing additional drone cameras, providing training and capacity building to Ukrainian military, which is under Operation Unifier. That's slated to occur this summer at the Royal Military College Saint-Jean. There's also an additional $48.8 million to the comprehensive assistance package for Ukraine that will support provisions of non-lethal practical assistance through donations of materials, including fuel, bridging equipment, rations, and first aid. And Trudeau also confirmed that, along with allies, that they will send a commitment to train Ukrainian pilots and officers to operate and maintain F-16 fighters. In the announcements as well, the Prime Minister was very adamant about strengthening Canadian commitments to NATO by renewing and expanding Operation Reassurance, as well as a huge sum of money, $450 million contract to Thales Canada to provide in-service support for CAF's minor warship and auxiliary vessels and the Kingston-class maritime coastal defense vessels. So given these announcements and given the reality that Canada's defense has been a problematic kind of aspect of its relationships with NATO members, and along with the fact that Canada's defense policy update is still under review, do these military pledges suggest that Canada's defense outlook is changing? And does it speak to maybe a determination that is happening in Ottawa to showcase that we are resolute in our ability and in our ambitions to uphold our treaty obligations that will see a more permanent Canada in Europe's security architecture? Paul, we'll start with you. What are your thoughts on this?
I don't see any very significant changes. I mean, Canadian defense policy and its attitude to NATO has been pretty consistent for 70 years, in that we do, you might say, the minimum required to get on the table and not a whole lot more. And that leads to lots of complaints about free riding and all the rest of it. But there's a reason why we do it that way, which is that whenever we try to do some more, as we did, noticeably in Afghanistan, we don't actually gain anything, obviously, from it. So it is actually logical to maintain one's spending at a certain level and one's involvement at a certain level, which is sufficient to get your place on the table, but not a whole lot more, because getting a whole lot more won't actually get you anything back very much. So, and that is why the governments come and go, and they issue white papers on defense saying, we are going to dramatically increase defense spending, or we're going to we're going to divert to the Arctic, or whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. They'll say they're doing something new, and they just end up pretty much following the same plank of policy, because it is the logical policy for Canada to pursue. And also politically, in terms of domestic politics, it's about as much as you can sell to a Canadian public, which rightly, in my opinion, doesn't see the benefits from, vastly increased expenditures on defense and vastly greater involvement in military activities around the world, from which, the average Canadian doesn't see any benefit when they're suffering already from, significant social problems at home. So there's a limit to how much you can sell. And if you put these factors together, you end up with a fairly consistent policy. And now, we're upping the ante a little bit, we're expanding our role in Latvia and so on. But it's not drastically out of whack with what we've done before. And I think it will remain, that way pretty much hereafter, I suspect. But I may be wrong, but that's my suspicion. I just think there are objective factors which push us in this direction. And but therefore, we shouldn't complain about it and say how terrible it is and we're shaming Canada before NATO. No, we're pursuing our interests in the way that has consistently been shown to be in our interest.
Thank you, Paul. And so we'll turn to you. What are your thoughts on this? Is it one of those things where the announcements come, it's great optics, it showcases that Canada is willing to step up its engagement, but then as soon as it gets back to Ottawa, like Paul said, the domestic narratives, the domestic politics come into play, and then there's backsteps. Is it still too early to see these pledges from Canada as anything beneficial for our presence in NATO?
Well, I think there's a couple things to note here. First off, I am the author of a book that's called Beyond Due Percent. So I spent 250 pages talking about this. So I'm going to be brief here. I collected a lot of data and, did a lot of analysis, statistical analyses. And, there's a couple of things that we need to underline. First is, what Canada is doing in Latvia. It is doing the same as countries that have much larger economies and much larger militaries. It is also doing the exact same thing with the most partners that have the most heterogeneous capabilities. And so basically Canada is taking a group like this that also has the most languages, and Canada gets to do that because it's considered bilingual everywhere else but in Canada, let's be clear. And it gets to do this with countries that have capacities like this, whereas everybody else kind of is partnering with countries that have a lot closer capabilities. So, it's doing the same output impact with something that's frankly quite more difficult to manage. And so I think that's one thing. Canada's increased presence in Latvia basically brings this contribution in line in terms of leading with the major countries. And so comparatively for a Canadian-sized military, that is quite impressive. And the other thing that I would know is that announcing that you're going to spend on all of these things and spending more on all of that is great, because we know Canada needs to spend more. But at the end of the day, Canada faces a recruitment problem. And you can only spend so much on all of those capital items, right? And frankly, if you don't have the troops, what are you spending the rest of it on? Right. And so in some senses, part of it is, issues that have to do with its own procurement and its own, recruitment systems. And so there is a plateau in which you can, if you sink in more money, you're simply not being, efficient. And we know that Canadians like efficient spending. They want, good pragmatic spending. And so it's an uphill battle. And again, as Paul said, there's simply, I talk about the Canadian public as being allergic to defense spending. And, it's true. The Canadian public would not, accept a 2%. It's just not sellable. But what we do see that I think is important, and one of the things that was on the side and not talked about very much in Canada, is that Canada did get the go-ahead, and 12 countries have now agreed that they're going to join the Canadian Center of Excellence, which is going to be on climate change and security, and it's opening in Montreal before the end of this year. And that's a quite big announcement, which didn't get very much media uptake, because frankly, it's not about, these centers of excellence are not about fighting a war. They're not about in the NATO command structure, but they are very much about the future of the alliance. And so again, this is a way that Canada is contributing. That's not, boots on the ground or, arms in somebody's hands. This is, this could actually be a contribution that ends up being far bigger than, what Canada may have be doing in missions if we go down the road 10 or 15 years. And I can say this because I'm studying the centers of excellence, and I'm right now at Stratcom, which is one of the jewels and the COE crown that NATO has.
Excellent. Thank you, Anessa. Zach, we'll go to you now. What are your thoughts on this? Is it one of those things, like Anessa said, where there is that kind of divide amongst the public where, we don't want to spend a hard 2% on, capabilities, but we are willing to do other things with our resources at play. But when we see what's going on, especially on the eastern flank, with Poland increasing its military, with now Finland and Sweden, in the mix of contributing their defense spending to NATO's total expenditure, does Canada need to spend more on hard power capability? Or is it one of those things where if we look at what it's doing right now, in terms of its contribution capacity commitments, is that enough, or is that sufficient to get Canada along with its commitments and obligations under the North Atlantic Treaty?
Well, let me preface this by saying that I think that there's one basic interest that our intellectual and political classes in Canada are capable of articulating, and that is our interest in being seen to appear as a good ally. So that's defining our interests in relational terms rather than based on first principles. And that's the only interest I think that we're really reflexively capable of articulating. And other than that, I don't think that we as a country have a general sense of what we should be spending money on, what capabilities we need, et cetera, because we aren't able to articulate our national interests. And that's the first conceptual stage before anything else. And if you look at different theaters, we're talking about different capabilities, right? If you're looking at Europe, you're looking at a terrestrial terrain. If you're looking at North America and the Arctic, you're looking at aerospace defense. If you're looking at the Asia Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific, as some are now calling it, you're in a naval theater there, right? So those are very different capabilities, overlapping in some respects. But at the end of the day, I think we need to ask ourselves the question: can we do all of those things well at the same time? And a lot of the research that we've done at IPD has focused on sort of defining, what constitutes still a middle power in the 21st century. And we have this reflexive itch in Canada to call ourselves a middle power, when in reality, we're no longer a middle power. I don't think that we really rise to that level anymore, because one of the prerequisites to being a middle power is being part of a regional security complex and being an influential actor within that regional security complex, being able to shape its norms and terms and rules. And I don't think that we are in any of the major geostrategic theaters on this planet. The old saying is that Canada is a regional power without a region. So if you look at the Euro-Atlantic region, I mean, when it comes to setting the future terms of Euro-Atlantic security, they will be set either peacefully or belligerently by Russia, the United States, Britain, France, Germany. I don't think that Canada is really in that same tier of countries. When it comes to the Asia Pacific, again, we're well behind on that front. Don't think that Canada is going to play the most significant role alongside, let's say, Japan, China, Indonesia, others, India, Australia, even in determining the balance of power, the general sense of regional architecture, economically, security-wise, et cetera, in that region. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with the conclusion that we're no longer a middle power, and I think we should think about our interests and therefore about our capabilities and our policy goals accordingly. I think it lends itself a little bit more to more of a continental foreign policy, at least for the next little while. And our involvement in Asia and in Europe should be ultimately based on that primary assumption, right? Should flow from that assumption. So, for example, our involvement in NATO could be increasingly centered on the Arctic dimension. right? Now that you've got Sweden and Finland that are joining NATO, there could be scope for the Arctic 7, not to entirely replace the Arctic Council, because at some point there will be a need to do something in that region with Russia. That's the whole purpose of the Arctic Council. But nonetheless, that could be our contribution to Euro-Atlantic security, could be through the Arctic lens, as it were. When it comes to Asia, again, I think that the Canadian government's Indo-Pacific strategy made an important conceptual leap forward by declaring the North Pacific as Canada's neighborhood, as Canada's region. The defense of North America, therefore, can extend to include the North Pacific, as it were, just like American Manifest Destiny to a certain extent included eventually, a civilizing mission in the Philippines, right? I think that's how we have to sort of think about these things, right? Start with the concepts and then build out our actual policy priorities from there, including regionally.
Thank you, Zachary. Andrew, we'll give the last word to you for this question. Particularly throughout your career and what you've seen in terms of Canadian defense policy, and then obviously the focus or the concentration of Canada's resources towards NATO, are the announcements and the pledges that Prime Minister Trudeau announced at this summit, is it worthwhile? Have we hit the nail on the head with each panelist, indicating their views, or do you have a different take going forward?
No, I don't have. I agree with the panelists preceding me, so I'll just amplify that from my own experience and where I saw the summit. For me, the idea is that we're never going to make the 2% because of all the things that other people have said. I agree. But so what we do is we take what we have and we put our flag on the map as best as we can. We put our forces and our deployments in the front window. So we maximize the show. And this augurs well with our allies, and we're shown to be doing the right thing. And also in domestics, because domestics drive it. So historically, we've always been a North Atlantic power engagement because of our French and British heritage. And in this particular case, we've got the Ukrainian diaspora, which is an important political consideration. And that reinforces Canada's commitment to the eastern flank, to say we're doing something there, besides all the other commitments to Ukraine in itself. But from a NATO point of view, the brigade in Latvia is important. It's in the announcement, in my opinion, of reinforcing our moving up from battalion group to brigade group, which we had pledged at Madrid last year, actually now fulfilling it, was the capstone announcement from a Canadian defense point of view. Now, having said that, if you compare though what we had in the Cold War at the 4th Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group in LAR compared to what we have in Latvia, you have 15 tanks, one squadron of tanks deployed in Latvia that will be coming, and in LAR we had a regiment of tanks, 40 tanks, and more troops and so on. All that to say is that we're doing the thing. We're getting the map on the board, but we have not gone into overdrive because we're still well behind our commitment that we had during the Cold War in Germany. As an example, we have a brigade there, we have a brigade here, and this is a really multinational brigade, not like the 4th Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group, which was a solid Canadian unit.
Thank you, Andrew. We'll now go to, seeing as we're coming to the end of the webinar, we have a question from the audience, and I think it's fitting to end on this note because it captures kind of what we discussed and how Canada can benefit NATO, particularly throughout, as Zachary pointed out, continental lens and incorporating the Arctic into our strategic concept for defense, but also build off or bridge off NATO's strategic concept for the Arctic. And that is with Finland and, with Finland's accession and Sweden, pending their admission into the alliance, how come there wasn't more of a focus for Arctic security in the communique? And going forward, how can Canada shape a future where NATO is more engaged, more present in the Arctic? And how can it work with the Arctic 7 going forward to secure its northern flank? I'll start with Zachary. We'll start with you. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'll defer to some of my colleagues who would, know better in terms of questions of capabilities more than I would. But I would just, add that if we're serious, if we want to get more serious about defense in the country, I think it helps to be able to have, and we've talked about this in this panel, a policy that we can sell to the Canadian people across the board as we're actually reflecting the national interest. And I think that defense of North America and of the Arctic is one thing that can tick that box. It's about the defense of Canada. People understand that. When we're talking about, some sort of amorphous liberal international order that we have to pay to support in Europe. That's a much more complicated thing to explain to the average voter. And it's, a vision of the national interest that theoretically could, talk about what we have in common as Canadians. And so to go back to what Andrew was just saying about sort of having a Ukrainian diaspora, and that this should, mobilize, or maybe it simply does mobilize, part of our foreign policy and defense engagement in Europe. I think that that's something that we're going to have to confront head on at some point. I mean, the extent to which we allow political considerations in diaspora communities in Canada to, influence the way we articulate our foreign policy interests is problematic. Ultimately, we're going to need to be able to articulate a national interest that most Canadians can buy into. And if the reality is that because of considerations, political considerations at the end of the day, related to various diaspora communities, it's going to hamper our ability to have functional relations of some kind with India, with China, with Russia. These are leading global powers here. And I'm not saying we need to get along with these countries. I'm not saying we're going to agree with them all the time, but we do need to have, at some point in the future, some kind of bilateral agenda with these countries that is institutionalized and that is on our own terms as Canadians, that reflects our own national interests, right? Because they are unique. Our interests are unique. We have our own distinct geography from other members of NATO. So again, this is just another reason why we shouldn't be defining our interests in relational terms.
Thank you, Zachary. Anessa, I'll go to you now, and I just want maybe encapsulate maybe short-term goals that Canada could do for increasing its presence and then its presence with NATO in the Arctic, particularly when it comes to the Center of Excellence. Do you see the Center for Climate Change being a huge, amplifier of Canadian, defense and Canadian foreign policy for the Arctic that can collaborate with the Arctic 7, and then as well as the Diana that had recently been confirmed to be stationed in Halifax? Are these, soft power capabilities that can be used in the short term to really gravitate Canada's push in the Arctic, as well as bringing in, NATO members that are Arctic nations and non-Arctic nations as well?
Okay, I think we have to be clear about what centers of excellence are and what they are not. They are definitely not in the NATO command structure. They are peace establishments. So you have to think about this as a kind of think tank meets a little bit of an education and training. And so again, this is a contribution, but it's not a contribution that it's like the type of one that's going to get a lot of media attention for being like, hey, it's troops and stuff like that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, when it comes to the Arctic, the entry of Finland and the eventual entry of Sweden is important because it does literally balance the icebreaker, distribution sheet between the A7 and Russia. So it does tend to equalize capabilities in one level of another, which is very important. Another thing that there hasn't been very much talk about, but is important for the Arctic and for Canada, is that in March now, so it's at least 3 months old, the Nordic air commanders signed a letter of intent to create a version of NORAD Light up there. And so this is important because when you look at that map of air identification zones, now those 4 zones have become one, and they decided that they're actually going to they actually are allocating jets to defend that space 100% of the time, just like we have in NORAD. So Canada should be really interested in that because, as we know, the seams and gaps in NORAD are one of the challenges. And so frankly, that they've taken this initiative and say, look, we're removing this. And not only that, we are giving this a level of capacity that's going to be able to do warning, surveillance, and possibly eventually defense like NORAD does. This is really important. And again, nobody in Canada is talking about it, but this literally is on our back door because it's the Arctic. And another thing I would note is that, when it comes to this center of excellence, we have to be real clear that it's about benefiting NATO, not about Canada. And again, I'm complaining because even Canada has changed this, has mutated this discourse a little bit. And this center should never be about what Canada wants to get out of it. It has to be about essentially, what Canada and the other countries can collaborate to contribute to NORAD when it comes to NORAD's climate change and climate change action plan and climate change strategy. And if you look at those 2 documents, they are extremely ambitious and they go everywhere from kind of mitigation to thinking about ways in which we can systematize understanding the, climate change data and kind of getting countries to voluntarily report different aspects of climate change data. So at the end of the day, the contribution of this may be something that goes much broader than, just that Euro-Atlantic. And this also brings the idea that, when we think about the Arctic, we also have to think about the Antarctic, because this is a world that is connected. And those are regions and where climate change is happening. And, our focus is frankly on the Arctic, but, we really have to think about, the ways in which we can bring this to kind of the global commons, which is what climate change is affecting. And so at the end of the day, yes, I think that this is a way for Canada to show some collaborative leadership and kind of take a file and go forward. But it's not exactly clear how that's going to be articulated at the end of the day. But I was quite pleased to see that, there's at least a dozen countries who have signed on. And so comparatively, a lot of other centers started with 5 or 6 countries. And so the fact that we have a dozen NATO allies, I think shows significant interest and commitment. And in fact, some countries have even decided to commit more than they need to, like Germany, who has now said that they are actually going to commit 2 representatives to it. So again, I think this is moving in the right direction, but we have to be clear, we understand what it can do, what it can't do. And that this is really about the future of the alliance and moving the alliance forward, not necessarily about operations and what's going on day to day. There's a link to some of that, but again, and this may be also why it sells in Canada, because frankly, it's not a commitment that's going to involve guns and putting people in the line of fire. And we know Canadian voters, particularly the young, because we've surveyed them, they are willing to, for example, pay more taxes if it's for things that are associated with combating climate change, with protecting the environment and all of that. And frankly, we know those are the voters that Trudeau wants. He needs those young voters. And so I think this speaks to those voters in ways that Latvia and Unifier simply do not.
Very interesting. Very interesting. And I agree that is an interesting dynamic that we tend not to see in our defense planning and in our projection with NATO. Andrew, Paul, before we end, do you have anything to maybe add on or to maybe indicate that hasn't been brought up yet in terms of Canada's presence in the Arctic and how we can work with its NATO allies to enhance the alliance's presence and security and deterrence capabilities in that region?
I'll just be very brief because also my iPhone's running out of battery power. Trudeau took a stab at that in the 70s, with the defense policy for Canadians. It was all Arctic sovereignty based and sort of thing. Problem was finding a threat. And basically it was ultimately just some surveillance capabilities, drop the airborne in for a few exercises, small stuff, sovereignty, Canada plants its flag. Now, Vanessa's outlined a very new modern way of approaching that. And I think she's got a really solid argument there. And it's sort of perhaps very Canadian. So that may be, in fact, the way forward, but it wouldn't be the traditional, let's move up Canadian forces up in the north to, defend our whole Arctic against the Russians or something. Not going to happen.
Yeah, Andrew, to some degree, stole my words, which was that if you're going to justify defense expenditures, you have to identify a threat. What are you defending against? And the reason increased defense expenditures and presence in the north has always failed is because the scale of the threat is very low. It always has been, and it still is. So I'm not against it in principle, but doing it, as Zach said, because it's something we can do. I don't think that's a good enough logic. If you're going to get involved in things military, you've got to be able to do a proper threat analysis and prove that there is a needed response of a military type. And personally, I'm not convinced that there isn't, and the Canadian public has never been convinced but there is, and I think that it's unlikely to be convinced that it is in the future. I'm less keen about squeezing military expenditures on the back of environmental challenges and so on. Civilian things are civilian things and military things are military things. Maybe it's like being an old soldier makes you think this way, but I agree
with you that makes you an old soldier.
I don't think you should justify military expenditure, which is quite a dangerous thing, to be honest, on the backs of something like climate change, which really should be dealt with and organized through civilian structures. That is my own personal view on it.
Excellent. Well, with that, we'll close this webinar. Before we conclude, I just want to extend a huge gratitude and a huge thank you for today's speakers for participating in this panel. I had a great time, partaking and just hearing your feedback, and especially at a time where we have been given so much information, so much knowledge after the summit. It's great to kind of have that little space and time and then have your input indicating, the successes, the challenges, as well as maybe some setbacks that occurred during the summit. And definitely it will be interesting to see, the gains that are made before the 2024 summit that is being held in Washington that also marks the 75th anniversary. So again, thank you so much for participating. I would also like to extend my gratitude to the audience for joining this afternoon, I guess I could say now, as well as providing questions that contribute to our discussion. Lastly, I just want to inform everyone that this webinar is being recorded and it will be published on IPD's website and its YouTube channel. I encourage everyone to subscribe to IPD's newsletter and follow IPD on social media for updates on future roundtables. So thank you very much, guys, and I hope you guys have a terrific weekend. And again, just thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Bye.